Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives and the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. We are continuing our series through Genesis 1 through 11 about the meaning of creation. Where does humanity belong? This is the 8th lesson in this series of a 10-lesson series, so we're coming towards the end, and we're going to be looking at the genealogies that scatter throughout Genesis 1 through 11. They take up a lot of space, and they are actually used to organize the text. So quite often we skip over these things, but I think it's going to be important to spend a lesson this week looking directly at them. So the question is, are we connected? This is the first part of this lesson, looking at the two sides of humanity. So we're going to examine the genealogy that is not as delineated, but is there in Genesis 4, 17 through 22. That is the genealogy of Cain. And then we're going to look at the typical one of the landmark genealogies, one of the big pieces that set apart the text in Genesis 5, 1 through 32, and that is the generations of Adam, or the Toledot. That's a very important word in Genesis. It marks the entire book. It shows up in 10 or 11 different places, creating the sections that are the text, the Toledot of, or the generations of, or the family line of, and at this point it's the family line of Adam. But as we can see, we have two genealogies here, both of them. Adam's not necessarily mentioned in 4, but we can see that he is implied there. And then this goes through Adam to Cain to a person named Enoch in Cain's life, to Irad, to Mehujael, to Methushael, and then Lamech. It ends with Lamech, and he has 3 sons and 1 daughter, Jabal, Jubal, Tubal, Cain, and Naamah. And then we see that compares to Adam's line, which there are 10 folks in that one: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, a different Enoch, Methuselah, a different Lamech, and then Noah, who has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the 7th place is always important in a genealogy, is often important in a genealogy. And the 7th place from Adam is this, through the line of Cain, is Lamech. And the 7th place from Adam through the line of Seth is Enoch. And these genealogies are written in such a way that it encourages us to compare the two. We say Lamech, Genesis 4, 19 through 24 is about him. It's an extended piece. He's the 7th generation from Adam in the line of Cain. He's a murderer like Cain. He does that kind of braggadocious poem about how Cain was avenged 7 times. He will be avenged 77 times. And he says he's killed someone for just hurting him. And it's just this, it doesn't seem to be like a request from God, asking God to protect him like God protected Cain. It seems more like a brag that if you hurt me, I will protect myself, even up to taking vengeance 77 times over what damage has been done. And this idea of 7th is an idea of completion. So it's this idea that Lamech is the epitome, is the completion, is the just basically the example of Cain's line. Lamech is the perfect example of his ancestor, Cain. Cain was a murderer. Lamech is a murderer. Cain is such and such in the sinful kind of self-centered way. Lamech has taken that to the 7th degree. And that is kind of what this genealogy is supposed to communicate to us, this how Lamech is like his ancestor, and even more so than his ancestor. Enoch is a little bit different with that. Enoch is the seventh generation from Adam in the line of Seth. It specifically says Enoch walked with God. And Enoch, there's this series in the Genesis 5 genealogy that says the same thing for everybody. But instead of saying Enoch lived, it said Enoch walked with God. And instead of saying Enoch died, it says Enoch was taken away by God after 365 years, which is years worth of years, so that sort of looks like completion. There's a couple other things. Noah also walked with God. Abraham also walked with God in Genesis. So this phrase walked with God becomes important. And then there's a Lamech in Enoch's line. In Enoch's line, actually in Seth's line, that lived 777 years, which seems to be also a notable play on Lamech in Cain's line, avenged 77 times. Well, Lamech in Seth's line lived for 777 years. So it's even more exaggerated than what Lamech in Cain's line tried to examine. So the idea is Enoch is the epitome of who Seth was. Enoch walked with God. Enoch did what was right, is shown to be that. And because of that, Enoch didn't die. We see that in that passage highlighting how Enoch was different than Lamech. So as we go through this list, this Genesis 5 list, we hear over and over again this constant refrain, became the father of, and also had other sons and daughters, which reminds us of the command of God from Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply, but also of the offspring and the painful labor in Genesis 3:15 through 16 with the curse after the fall. The hope of humanity through a future offspring of the woman continues as humanity fulfills God's command. But on the other side of that, not only are they being fruitful, but they're also dying. But the ending phrase, then he died, for 8 of the 10 individuals in this line, then he died, as a constant reminder of the shadow of death that the fall from chapter 3 has brought to humanity. So we see this hopeful fulfilling of God's command. They're definitely being fruitful. They're definitely multiplying other sons and daughters, and he gave birth. There's this idea that it's all there, and then he died. So there's also the curse. So it's this two sides of humanity. Not only is Lamech from Cain the evil side of humanity, and Enoch from Seth a representative of the good side of humanity, but we also see that in each one of us, we have this fruitfulness of following God's command, being fruitful and multiplying, and receiving God's blessing. But we also have this death sentence because of the curse and because of the separation from God that happened at the fall. So there's two sides of humanity, a couple ways in here. Now let's look at this Genesis 5:21 through 24, talking about Enoch. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch should say lived there, but walked faithfully with God 300 years. So right there is the first part of the text that is different than all the other descriptions of all the other people in this genealogy. Although Enoch lived a total of 365 years, so 365 is short compared to the others, but it is also a year's worth of years, so it could be completed. Enoch walked faithfully with God. And then it should say here he died, but it says then he was no more because God took him away. So there's some significant differences here that communicate to us. First of all, pay attention to Enoch. Second of all, there's this idea. Genesis 2 and 3 give the impression that God walked with Adam frequently before the fall, especially verse 3:8. Both Lamech and Noah and later Abraham are said to walk with God. Although the fall has happened, it is still possible to walk with God, even outside of the garden. And this idea, whereas Adam is precluded from the garden and Cain is driven from the presence of God, Enoch experiences that privilege and escapes the sentence of his predecessor's death. So Enoch is a very hopeful person in this genealogy. He doesn't. He's relating to God in a way that both Adam and Cain could not. He's engaging in walking with God, which actually from these passages and development throughout the experience of the Israelites in the desert, walking with God becomes the euphemism for having a relationship with God, being righteous, being holy. We see that idea of walking with God in wisdom literature, various notions such as the way or the path of righteousness, the way everlasting, not going to the right or to the left, are so forth and so forth, are rooted in the pictures provided by the stories of Enoch, Noah, and Abraham in the Genesis narrative. So this idea that Enoch walked with God becomes a metaphor to describe the spiritual life of righteous Israelites throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, and even to this day. We follow Jesus. Is an idea. Now, Genesis 4 and 5 are specifically written to show the contrast between the faithful descendants of Seth versus the unfaithful descendants of Cain. Given the context, then I believe these are the sons of God, the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of humans, the descendants of Cain, found in chapter 6, 1 through 8. Chapter 6, 1 through 8, which we'll probably talk about with the Noah flood next week, or in the next lesson, is a very, very complicated and confusing passage. There's a lot of descriptors in there that don't quite find context in other ways. We don't always know what they're talking about. I believe this passage and these two genealogies would have been interpreted by the readers as explaining who the sons of God were and who the daughters of man were. So that's just my 2 cents looking forward at that. Some questions to talk about. Why do we care about our ancestors? What's important? What's going on there? What are we trying to learn about the world around us from the ancestors? And kind of related to that, what are some perspectives that the genealogies add to the narrative of Genesis 1 through 11? What wouldn't we know if Genesis 1 through 11 did not have these genealogies? And what are some ways the idea of walking with God is used in the New Testament and in current Christian culture? So if you have any interesting answers or even uninteresting answers, drop down in the comments, respond to these questions. I would love to engage you in conversation around them. As always, there are 3 ways to join this conversation: in person Sunday nights at 5 p.m. in the JEMIC, live Monday night 7 p.m. via Zoom, weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and or WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Like, subscribe, and follow where appropriate. I enjoyed having this conversation with you. Hopefully it continues real soon.